Yeah, I think we should.
Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. We think our chair is on his way from the airport, but when he shows up, we'll let him take over. We have a quorum present, therefore we're going to go ahead and start. If you have not signed in at the back of the room, would you sign in? We'd appreciate it so we'd just know who's present. This time we'll have a roll call of the board members. Ann, if you would call the roll.
Robert May.
Here.
Andrew Cable.
Here.
Leslie Poole.
Here.
Robert Massengill.
Here.
Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Wayne Roberts.
Here. At this time, we will consider approval of the May 14, 2014 board minutes, and I would entertain a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
So moved.
Second. We have a motion by Mr. Brainerd and a second by Mr. Roberts that we will approve that we will suspend the reading of the minutes. At this time, we will have a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. Second.
Motion by Mr. Roberts, second by Mr. Brainerd that we approve the minutes. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed by the same sign. The motion is approved. This time we'd like to take an item excusing the absence of board members from the May 14, 2014 board meeting. The chair entertains a motion to excuse Robert Massengill and Andrew Cable from the May 14, 2014 board.
I don't know about this one.
Well, maybe somebody else should have handled that.
So moved.
I second.
We had a motion by Mr. Roberts and a second by Mr. May to approve to excuse the Mr. Massengill and Mr. Cable from the May 14 board meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, no. The motion is approved. This time we'll discuss and consider the following items related to the minimum educational training program for trustees and system administrators pursuant to Section 802.211 of the Texas Government Code. And I would like to call on Michelle Cranes to address that item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. I am Michelle Cranes with the PRB staff. Since the last board meeting, the draft rules on the minimum educational training program were published in the Texas Register for public comment for a period of 31 days. We received comments from 2 retirement systems and 1 individual commenter. Behind tab 2A, you'll find a summary of the comments as well as staff's response and recommended changes. The comments include typographical corrections, clarifications, and a few more substantive requested changes. And if it's okay with you, I'd plan to go through the document highlighting the more substantive comments as well as the comments with which staff disagrees. And of course, if you have questions on any of the comments, I'll be happy to answer those.
Very good.
So the first section that we received comments on is 607-104. They are technical clarifications, except for number 3 on page 2, which is more substantive. And staff agreed with including a definition that we previously, of a term that we'd used but previously not defined, and that's net actual instruction time. The next comment, number 4, a commenter had asked to have another term, which is suitable facility, defined. And on this one, staff disagreed, believing that suitable facility should be generally interpreted to mean a facility that constitutes an acceptable learning environment with appropriate lighting and temperature controls, etc. The next section with comments is 105. Comment number 5. The commenter asked to clarify, and now let me step back. This relates to the exemption for systems under Chapter 810 that do not have traditional public retirement boards. So the working group had designed, in conjunction with those plans, an exemption for trustees that really don't bear the fiduciary duty or make the day-to-day decisions for those plans. This exemption was, as I say, worked through with the working group in those systems. We didn't receive any comments from those systems along similar lines. And the rules do state that if a council or commission member is serving as a trustee of an actual governing body of a public retirement system, that individual would not be exempt under the rule. So we recommended no change. Section 107 is technical corrections for clarity that staff agreed with. When you get to 110, again, they are mostly clarifications that staff agrees with and has recommended changes, except for number 13 on page 6. Okay, here the commenter asked that trustees who serve even-numbered terms and end up with a one-year period for continuing education, you may remember the rules are designed to essentially exempt them from continuing ed during that short period because the continuing education requirement is a 2-year requirement. The commenter asked, could our trustees not receive credit for training that we do during that year? And from staff's perspective, in working with our database administrator as well, this change would be quite difficult for us, to be honest, administratively and database-wise, to accommodate giving credit during periods where it's not required would be it would require a lot of work. However, we do want to raise that this change, this comment did raise for us questions about the viability of the 2-year continuing education requirement going forward, and it's something that I think staff and the board might want to continue to look at as the program rolls out over the next 2 years in terms of whether a 1-year requirement, so going from 4 hours every 2 years to 2 hours every year for continuing education, might be easier for the plans and for us. So we didn't recommend that change at this point, but raise it for future consideration.
And members, I just wanted to add that when the working group looked at this item, the general idea was to be as flexible as possible in allowing folks with their to meet their CE. This obviously preceded our staff work with our database administrator, and in that's where we've identified that we can carry out this 2-year window, but it certainly poses a little bit more complication on the administrative side. And I think this comment, as Michelle pointed out, really brought to light some of those technical issues that the staff will have to work through between now and January when we unveil the database. So we wanted to at least bring it out and make the board aware that this is something that, in our minds, and again, obviously, I think as previously noted in other board meetings, we may need to revisit items here. We were given a very short time to roll this program out, essentially, and that we've relayed that throughout the process, that if there are ways to improve or considerations that we might have missed in this process, that staff want to make sure that we bring it to the board's attention in the future. And so we just wanted to plant that seed as we move forward, that, as we identify ways to either make it more efficient or concerns that are raised, that we will keep the board apprised on those matters.
Mr. Hanson, are you saying that the comment may have merit, but the problem that you all have with it is primarily an administrative implementation?
I think from the comment having merit, there's two sides to it. One is the sense that we understand that folks who are in that exempt period, it's an odd fitting to have a period where nothing applies, and so it may make sense to go to an annual CE, because that way there's at least a requirement to get some. But I think one of the issues with allowing pre-credit, we're doing that for the grandfathered members, but 5 years from now, if we allow training from one period to count for another, that could be very problematic to implement by itself. That would become very labor intensive, because staff are going to have to do a lot of manual entry of when people actually got that training. We've had instances where a plan administrator asked, well, I have trustees who haven't been appointed yet. If they're not appointed till next year, but they get training in November, will that count? Other folks who've wanted training, and a comment we'll get to later, any training ever received prior to appointment to count. So in some ways, this comment opens Pandora's box by allowing, how would we track all of that training? However, one item that we thought received some merit was the idea that the even numbered terms, when you get that under 2-year window potentially, that might merit another look to maybe moving to an annual requirement of 2 hours. That way those members have some requirement to take training. And I think ultimately the idea is this is the minimum. We encourage folks to take more than that. But what would count in a cycle, that's, I think, something we could look at again.
So you're suggesting that we might consider this suggestion later on. For the time being, we're trying to get these rules out in the interest of expedience.
Yes, that is correct.
Deadlines. Thank you.
Okay, the next comment with which staff disagrees is on page 8, number 15. This is the one that Chris was just referring to, where a commenter raised that many of their trustees have completed certified trustee training with the Texpers prior to January 1st of 2013, and they're asking to have trustees who've ever taken that course to receive credit for it. Now, as you'll recall, the rules have built into them what we call a look-back period to allow current trustees to apply for credit for training that they've done during the previous 2 years, which are 2013 and 2014. The working group and board had discussed that carefully and chosen a 2-year look back, I think, from the perspective that you have to basically stop somewhere, acknowledging that at some point knowledge does become outdated. So staff is not recommending a change there. On page 9, so section 113 has technical changes with which staff agrees, except for number 18 on page 9. Here, the commenter asked about the break-in service provision. This is where reappointed trustees and administrators would be able to would be exempt from repeating the 7-hour core if they'd not had a break-in service of more than 2 years. Again, the working group and board discussed this at length and chose 2 years as the time frame for that break-in service. The commenter suggested 5 years, and so we are not recommending a change there in line with the board and working group's discussions on this issue. In section 120, we have mostly technical corrections, except for number 22 on page 10. This commenter asked that a provision be changed from the negative to the positive tone. The provision, for your reference, states that staff meetings and other settings cannot be claimed for credit if they do not meet the requirements of the chapter. And essentially what we're saying there is something covered briefly in a staff meeting, for example, does not constitute an actual training with elements such as an instructor and course objectives. So rewording this to the positive, we fear, would more along the lines encourage than discourage, which is what staff was intending to do here, and could introduce some vagueness into the rule, so we've not agreed with that change. Section 122 is a technical change. In 124, comment 24, a system asked that statewide systems be allowed to apply for accreditation but not be subject to the standards laid out in 124A. And staff felt that these standards should simply apply uniformly to every system and has disagreed with that change. The next substantive comment for our discussion will be on page 12, number 26. This is a similar comment where a system asked that statewide plans or plans with assets of more than $1 billion not have to reapply for accreditation. And staff again here felt that the standard of renewal should be applied uniformly to every system. as established by the working group and board. We didn't want to set up separate standards for certain systems. And the renewal period, as you'll recall in the rules, is set at an initial 2-year renewal and then every 4 years thereafter, which we thought was reasonable. The very next comment, 27, this commenter asked, again, that a certain provision not be applicable to statewide systems, and this specifically, these are standards that are written into the rules for all providers of education, and they include things such as providing certificates of completion to show that a participant has completed the course, and requiring instructor evaluations to allow for the entity to receive feedback on the quality of their training. Staff thought that these standards should apply uniformly, again, to systems across the board, and also as a way of trying to make an effort to make things easier for public retirement systems that are doing in-house training, which I think this comment was mostly designed to address. We would be able to consider offering a template, so a template of a certificate and also of an instructor evaluation. So the systems don't have to create those things themselves and can simply use our forms. Section 128 it contains technical changes, except for number 29 on page 14. Here, the commenter was commenting on the fact that much of their training is provided at board meetings, and was concerned with the requirement that systems provide or apply for approval of courses 30 days in advance of providing those courses. And staff here wanted to first clarify that the system wouldn't need to receive approval from PRB to offer those courses or for those courses to count for credit, but rather would need to submit their application, which I know is a fine distinction, but it would provide a little bit more time. So they would just need to get an application in for that board meeting training within 30 days beforehand. And there is an exception written into the rules that anyone can submit, sponsors and participants can submit training after they've already participated or attended afterwards in exceptional cases. And the commenter had asked that we change this to say certain rather than exceptional. Staff felt that certain could change the meaning there and open up a broader door and introduce some vagueness, where we really think that it should be exceptional cases that merit that going past the deadline of getting things approved, or submitting things for approval 30 days beforehand. I hope I was clear. I said a lot of words there.
And members, I wanted to add, for all of these comments, we've worked with our Attorney General Counsel to review, and I think there were probably some cases where staff may have looked at something originally and thought, could we work with this commenter, and working with our counsel and taking a look at it from maybe a legal perspective, an administrative perspective. We included that in our formal final recommendations to the board. I think this was a case where originally we might have felt that certain seemed reasonable, and then looking at it from a legal point of view, we were counseled that exceptional is the more appropriate word. It does not prevent cases where you could apply after the fact. It's just, as mentioned, to discourage heavily using after the fact, but it's certainly, I think the general sense was that exceptional is a better defined term in this case. And again, I think on all these comments, we've worked with our counsel to make sure we hadn't missed anything.
Thank you, Chris.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question, please? Sure. Chris, I think that a fair bit of education and training for some of these board members, many board members, in fact, is likely to occur in the process of normal board meetings. Is this rule, in those cases, is this rule saying that the system would need to notify the PRB 30 days in advance that we're going to have a board meeting, and at this board meeting we may have, for example, an actuary providing a certain type of training, or an investment consultant and so on?
It would encourage them to do that 30 days in advance. It wouldn't prohibit if they said 1 day in advance they provided us that, or after the fact. Again, what we're trying to do with that language is encourage providing us that information in advance so we can review it. It gives the staff and the process more time. It would not prohibit the fact that if they provided us 7 days in advance or 5 days in advance. And a lot of systems do provide training in the course of their meeting. Additionally, if a system were to become an accredited in-house sponsor, there's a separate process for that where they would not have to apply in advance for each meeting. Thus, any training they provide, as long as they provide the backup in accordance with the rules, would count, so they wouldn't have to even deal with this section. So there's two routes for boards who are providing training at their meetings could go. One is to just generally be accredited so that any training they provide would count. Second would be to do this one-off type of application. Again, we have the 30-day advance to encourage applying in advance, probably in some cases for systems that haven't been doing that, so that maybe we have an opportunity to review what their training provides. However, it does not prohibit them from providing that in less time or after the fact. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and the final change I'd like to discuss is on the last page, 16. This is a change recommended by staff in response to a question we received relating to the rules specifically for current trustees, that look back that the rules provide for. And we had not realized that the look back really spoke to the 7-hour initial core requirement, but had not included language to make clear that current trustees, after those 2 years that they have to fulfill their 7-hour core or ask for credit for previous training, would then become subject to the continuing education requirement like everyone else. So this simply inserts that language to clarify that continuing education on a 2-year cycle would start at that point. That concludes my prepared presentation on the comments. I'm happy to take any other questions.
Let me recognize our chair who is present, Paul Brayton, and I would be happy for him to take over.
Thank you, Robert. I apologize for being late. My flight was delayed. Thank you, Michelle. And I thought the materials, when I went through them, were very helpful in the way you portrayed them in terms of the chart and saying the language changes in the comments. It was really easy for us all to follow along, so thank you for that good work.
Thank you.
If there were no questions, this would be done.
Okay. If the board doesn't have any additional questions, I don't know if anyone in the audience had any comments with respect to the rules, or we'll stop for a moment in case people want to comment on it. Clearly, there's been input throughout the process. All right. Seeing no comments, let's see this, where we are.
So we would be, yes, moving to, considering the modifications. Yeah. So B would be, and we should have,
Okay. Okay, so now we're at item 4B, which is consider modifications to and final adoption of the rules proposed in Texas Administrative Code, Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, relating to the Public Retirement System Minimum Education Training Program, including Texas Administrative Code, Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, Subchapter A, relating to the general provisions, Texas Administrative Code, Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, Subchapter B, relating to minimum education training requirements for trustees and system administrators, and Texas Administrative Code, Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, Subchapter C, relating to minimum education training program sponsors. Is there any discussion? Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion to adopt the rules as presented.
so moved.
Second. Motion made by Mr. Cable, seconded by Mr. Massengale. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Just finish up that motion about making sure because we got.
Okay, let me just make sure, Andrew, that your motion also indicates that in addition to adopting the rules as proposed, they also authorize staff to post the rule adoption notice in the Text and Register with the preamble to be approved by the Assistant Attorney General Counsel.
Absolutely.
I'm Melissa Wattis with the Attorney General's office. And on that motion, on the, as proposed, originally was as presented, and that's fine. But if you're going to do it as a proposed, adopt as proposed, it would be adopt as proposed with changes.
Okay, as noted, let's do this all over again. So I will entertain a motion to adopt the rules as presented in the Texas Administrative Code, Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, relating to the Public Retirement System Minimum Education Training Program, and authorize the staff to post the rule adoption notice in the Texas Register with the preamble to be approved by the Assistant General Counsel.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Cable, second by Ms. Greco-Poole. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, the next item is to review and consider approval of the curriculum guide for minimum education training to provide further guidance on the core and non-core content areas of the minimum education training program. Go ahead, Michelle, is this you?
Thank you. So behind tab 2C is a draft of the curriculum guide. As the chairman stated, this guide is designed to provide guidance to public retirement systems and educational sponsors in meeting the core and non-core minimum education requirements. This same draft was presented to the board at the last board meeting, and we're now requesting approval of the guide. The draft was also presented to the working group members who did not have any suggested changes. I'd be glad to answer any questions about the guide.
And members, just this is referenced in the rules, but it is not part of the rules. It's intended as a supplemental policy document. Again, during the working group process, there were questions about what would count under different areas, and staff developed this in conjunction with the working group and our constituents. And again, this can be fluid, it can evolve over time, but we did want to have something as the rules have been adopted that helps our constituents, give them more guidance on what was intended in these areas.
Anyone have any questions or comments on the guide?
Mr. Chairman, I move the curriculum guide for minimum educational training as presented.
A motion from Keith stating that you move to approve the curriculum guide for minimum education training to provide further guidance on the core and non-core contents areas of the MET program as presented.
Second.
Motion made by Keith, seconded by Wayne. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next item would be the review and consider approval of the following forms related to the minimum education training program. The first form being the sponsor accreditation application form.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Behind tab 2E is, 2D. You will find two forms, as the chairman just stated, relating to the accreditation process outlined in the rules. The first form is the one that education providers, or sponsors we call them, would use to apply for accredited sponsor status. That is the status that Chris mentioned earlier, whereby sponsors could become accredited, have us do a thorough review of their coursework in advance, and then not have to apply for approval of each individual course that they offer. The second form is the form that sponsors or course participants themselves would use to apply for approval of an individual course. Staff is requesting approval of both forms at this point.
Since requesting approval of both forms, let's go ahead and read in for the record. The second item was for the individual course approval application form, which is what you just described. Does anyone have any questions on these forms? Okay, then I'd entertain a motion to approve the sponsor accreditation application form and the individual course approval application form relating to the MET program as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Cable, seconded by Mr. Massengale. Any further questions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so I think that moves us to item 4E, which is receive report on the development of the proposed draft of PRB rules, Chapter 607, Subchapter D, relating to compliance with the minimum training requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Behind tab 2E is a summary of the second set of rules for the MET program. The draft rules themselves are behind tab 2F. These draft rules relate to compliance tracking, including how systems will report their training hours to the PRB and record-keeping requirements. The draft rules in regards to reporting establish 2 reporting dates per year for systems to report their trustee and administrators' training hours to the PRB. Now, systems could certainly report their hours more frequently, and especially if we are able to provide an electronic reporting system through which the administrator or their designee could log in and report the training hours for themselves and their trustees. But training hours would have to be reported at a minimum every February and September. No systems would be required to report any hours, again unless they chose to, until February 1st of 2016, and that's in line with the gradual rollout of the program. To allow PRB to track training compliance, the draft rules also require systems to keep the PRB updated of any changes to trustees or administrators and their terms and other information needed to be able to track training. And finally, the draft rules require systems to retain training activity attendance records for 5 years for each trustee and administrator, and those records would be subject to review at the request of the board. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Does anyone have any questions? This was under 4E, which is just a report delivered. Let me go ahead and read 4F into the record, which would be the action item. Consider approval to publish the rules proposed in the Texas Administrative Code, Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, Subchapter D, relating to compliance with the minimum training requirements in the Texas Register for public comment. So that's the item on the rules themselves.
Members, just to add a little bit more background, in reviewing and during the working group process, this item came up several times, and typically it deferred to what was easiest on the administrative side for the staff. We focused on these 2 dates because our reporting fiscal year ends August 31st, so by September 1st, for purposes of the Legislative Budget Board performance measures and our biennial report, where we will present the prior year's compliance, this worked well for the PRB so that we could meet those deadlines. Additionally, we added the February 1st because it coincided with the beginning of session, and certainly anybody who completed additional training, we wanted to be able to have as current information going into a legislative session as possible. So we felt that those dates were far enough apart, it's almost semi-annual, that it would allow us, one, to meet our requirements of agency reporting, and then also keep the legislature informed for folks who get training done between September and the beginning of session. So that was the rationale behind those two dates.
Mr. Chairman, Chris, was staff appropriated resources to comply with this program?
We were appropriated resources that we requested for the development of a database, and for staff, there was a decision in our budget for the upcoming fiscal year to fund a portion of our requested funding through appropriated receipts. So we are, and that is part of our legislative appropriations request, is to restore that $30,000. So we are a little bit less going into next year than we had hoped to be. We have adjusted resources as needed, essentially by not filling one of our vacant FTE positions to ensure that we have the ability to do this. That just affects us in other areas. But we were given additional resources coming out of last session with a rider through House Bill 13.
Any other questions? If not, I would entertain a motion to authorize the Executive Director to publish the rules as presented, which are proposed in Texas Administrative Code Title 40, Part 17, Chapter 607, Subchapter D, relating to compliance with the minimum training requirements in the Texas Register for public comment, pending final approval by the Assistant Attorney General Counsel, Working Group Chair, and the Board Chair.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Roberts, seconded by Mr. Cable. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. I want to take a moment just to thank the staff and everyone involved in this process. I mean, it's been a lot of work to come this far, and we're almost done in terms of setting up the minimum education training requirements. You all did a good job, putting together something from scratch, pursuant to the instruction of the legislature. So, thank you all.
Mr. Chairman, if I could say a word too.
Sure.
Especially for Chris and Michelle. It was a tremendous amount of work that they put into this. They've weighted the comments strongly by the plans, and I think it was fair and equitable what they came out with, and this is something to be proud of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, the next item is to receive update from staff on the following development of the minimum education training program compliance database and development of PRB training.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's nothing in your board packet related to this, but I'll give you a verbal update. On the compliance database, we've been working with our database administrator and have established the feasibility of an online system, as I mentioned earlier, for systems to log in and report their required training hours themselves. We've now moved into the development phase and are working closely with the database administrator to design a system that we hope will allow plans to easily input their training hours. On the PRB providing our own online training to help systems meet the core requirements. We are planning to offer online training in at least the core content areas and staff has now purchased a course authoring tool used by many of our peer agencies that will allow us to start building those courses, and we hope to be able to focus on that a little more once these rules are in place.
And members, just to provide a little bit more background on our expected rollout, we're hoping, with all being on schedule, that in early 2015 we would have the online database available. There are various degrees of online databases. Given our budget, this is probably going to be as lacking of bells and whistles is possible because of the funding levels we were given. But we do believe with the budget that we have and our programmer who's worked with us before and always delivered exceptional results, that we will have something that allows the systems to designate an administrator to log in and update their training completed by themselves and their board, or they could designate somebody for the plan. Again, we wanted to try to make this as convenient as possible for the systems. We would hope that we would be able to get this rolled out early enough in 2015 when the program is there that we can folks can start using it. So our expectation would be by the December meeting that we have a pretty good working framework. At that point, we're in the beta testing mode, working out any bugs or anything that may be there before we go into rollout. Additionally, with the online training, as Michelle noted, we did acquire a training program that allows us to create online training through what is essentially Blackboard, is the main learning management background of it. It's actually, the program uses that as SoftChalk, and it is used by other state agencies. It was the most affordable option available that met our needs, and so we've done that. We will be working this fall on prior presentations that we've developed under these core areas, such as actuarial presentations, other areas such as fiduciary duty, where some of our board members have made presentations in the past. We'll probably be reaching out to you to work on opportunities to use your PowerPoints or update them where necessary. We have also gotten technology to create video. We were able to acquire an affordable video camera so that we can create online training, add quizzes. So I think we've got all the means necessary to provide this online training. This online training was included in House Bill 13, as well as it was a recommendation of the Sunset Commission that the PRB move in the direction of providing online training. We expect that we'll have courses rolled out by the beginning of January. We may not have all 7 at that point, but our expectation is that over the next year or so that we would start being able to complete and offer courses in all 7 core areas for basic training, and then obviously look at our opportunities going forward to maybe offer more intermediate or advanced training as well. So we will probably be reaching out to the members and their various expertise for assistance in these different areas. And so we just want to give you a heads up on that. That'll be kind of the next stage of this project.
Anyone? Go ahead.
Question. Chris, this is a broader question. I noticed that the group of plans that we call TELFRA will be having their meeting, I believe, in Marshall later in late September. Is TELFRA considering any move to organized training?
Well, part of the sunset process directed us to provide additional training. I will be presenting at that conference, and we are working with them. They did have representation on the working group, so we are working with those funds to make sure that we sync everything up with them. The conference, for trustees and administrators who are attending this conference, who will be trustees and administrators as of January 1st when the program requirements go into effect, they can use training they receive at this conference to count towards credit for meeting the minimum requirements. And our expectation is, as we are developing these modules online, that we would also develop an ability to present them at future conferences, such as TELFRA conference in 2015. So we will be working with them, and we've been working with those folks throughout the working group process. So we will continue to do that. And again, that was part of the sunset bills last session. And so we will continue to make sure we're fulfilling that transition and working with them to ensure that they're getting the training that they want and need. And again, as well, to make sure that the training they get at their TELFRA conferences, whether it's peer review or the annual, counts towards meeting these minimum requirements.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so no actions required with respect to 5. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go. Okay, our next item is item 6, receive reports from the Actuarial Committee on the following meetings: the June 17, 2014 meeting and the August 14, 2014 meeting. And I'll turn it over to Bob.
Yes, and just briefly before I pass this across to Chris, we've met a number of times, as many of you know. Chris, have we met 3 times, 4 times, 5 times? I've lost track, but a number certainly. And so we've passed out documents along the way. So that's more of gives you a sense of what the actuarial committee has done. And then I'll turn it to Chris to discuss the detail of right now the minutes of these earlier meetings.
Members, and I believe it's at least 5 meetings since November. November, January, I believe we met in April, June, and August. The actuarial committee met. And members, we've included behind tab 3A and 3B the approved minutes of the June 17th meeting and the draft minutes of the August 14th meeting of the actuarial committee. And we wanted to include that because since the May meeting, the committee has met twice, and there's been substantial discussion and movement in regards to the study of the financial health of public retirement systems in the state. I'll just briefly touch on some of the highlights, and obviously the committee members can provide any additional background or thoughts that they have. At the June 17th meeting, the committee covered a wide range of topics, including using the guidelines as the standard for the study, as well as updating reports that we typically present to the board, specifically the actuarial evaluations report, and modifying some of that data in a way that would be applicable to the study, including information such as the plan status, because there are systems in the state that we call closed or frozen, meaning they've either shut down their plan entirely and there are no new accruals of benefits for any members, or they've closed that plan to any new employees that come in and they go into a different plan. The funding requirements of those types of systems are different, and the numbers as they're presented need to be interpreted a little bit differently than an active open system. Additionally, there was some discussion about recommendations that the committee was looking at and other models in other states that were asked to be presented at the August meeting. There was a walkthrough of preliminary findings of the historical research staff had done. And there was a lot of public and discussion and comment from the members of the audience of different ideas that they wanted to have the staff research and come back at the August meeting and present. So that in a nutshell is what happened at the June meeting. I'd be happy to answer any questions or let the committee members further elaborate on any thoughts from that meeting.
From looking at the notes, the minutes, you can see how some of the concepts that were discussed evolved into the preliminary report that we're going to discuss under the next action item. But do any of the committee members want to make any additional comments at this time? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I would only say that we asked the staff to do a lot on this report, and I think that they complied and they did a lot of work, and the work was very well done.
Members, going into the August 14th meeting, staff had presented at the request of the committee members, and you'll notice in the appendices of the preliminary report, a lot of additional information. Significant inclusions were information from the Texas County and District Retirement System and the Texas Municipal Retirement System. I'd like to thank both those systems for their quick response and working with us. They provided a lot of information, worked with the staff and the committee members to make sure that we've accurately represented the uniqueness of those two systems. I think in some of the board meetings prior to the committee meetings, there was some discussion about the need to include those systems because they represent so many actual local systems across the state. 656 counties and districts in the state of Texas, and nearly 850 municipalities are members of these systems, all with their own individual retirement systems, obviously under an umbrella system. As noted by the committee members leading up, that it was important to include information on those systems in our report. Additionally, at the August meeting, the staff had provided a little bit more background on findings and recommendations. And at the request of committee members, as we move into the next, the presentation of the preliminary draft, we've fleshed out the recommendations. We included some specifically where there was consensus, others where there maybe was some discussion that, hey, maybe the full board needs to look at some of these items. We've presented those as additional recommendations. We've taken commentary from the committee members to highlight certain key findings, which I will go through in the next agenda item. But it was a very productive meeting, and the staff used that meeting to essentially finalize the report that we'll get to here in a moment. Be happy to answer any questions on that meeting, or if the committee members have any additional information they want to cover.
Anything additional on the August 14th meeting? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next item, which is item 7. Discuss and consider study of the financial health of public retirement systems in the state as required by Section 7 of House Bill 13, 83rd Legislature, including the following items. Let's start with A. Receive report on the following. Study the financial health of public retirement system in the state, including each system's ability to meet its long-term obligations. Recommendations on how a public system may mitigate its risk of not meeting its long-term financial obligations. Okay, so Bob, you want to lead us in this?
Well, I again will pass this on to Chris to flesh out in discussion, and I may make a comment or two as we go.
Okay.
Members, I'll lay out, my intention is to go through item 1 to discuss the draft report before you, all the way up to the findings and the appendices, and then I'll hold off on the recommendations. We'll move into that on item 2. So I'll walk you through how we got to everything up to the recommendations, answer any questions that members may have, and then explain what we have before you regarding the recommendations. And I did want to note, as we go into this, that staff this week have still been editing, fine-tuning language. We've probably read this thing dozens of times, and there are always little edits that you notice on a pass-through. And I'd like to thank all the staff who've helped in the editing of this, because everybody has contributed and is contributing. We have also added a cover page and table of contents that we've prepared for when we release the preliminary version of this report. That being said, I'll get into the meat of the report. Obviously, we start with an executive summary that outlines the genesis of this, which was House Bill 13, and how the legislature asked the board to conduct the study of the financial health of public retirement systems in the state, including each system's ability to meet its long-term obligations, taking into account the contributions made by, benefits paid by, and investments made by the public retirement system. The board was also asked to include findings and recommendations on how a system may mitigate its risk of not meeting its long-term obligations. So that was the charge that we were working with. Our executive summary outlined some key findings in the preliminary report, as well as some key recommendations. We then move into an introduction of the uniqueness of Texas retirement systems, the state and local systems, governing statutes, the different levels of systems, the TELFRA, Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act systems, systems governed under Chapter 810, and try to provide a little bit of background. As you will have noticed, there are several appendices included in this draft report. Part of that reflects the very unique nature of public retirement systems across the state of Texas. And ultimately, the goal was to try to keep the main part of this report, originally was under 15 pages. We did keep it under 20 pages. And then to not flood that portion of the report with additional information, to use appendices to convey a lot of this additional information that we talk about. So after the introduction, we move into the basic pension funding equation. C plus I equals B plus E. Contributions plus income equals benefits plus expenses. That is the formula of defined benefit pension funding. So we walk into a short description of that. Then we move into the real-world implication of C, I, B, and E. And the economic impact on public retirement systems really walks through the impact the economy has on our retirement systems, the impact member and employer contributions have on our retirement systems, levels of employment, and other factors, really to provide some real-world background on C plus I equals B plus E. The next portion of the report provides an aggregate overview of information for our public retirement systems covered in the report. We show the rebound in total assets since the 2008-2009 downturn, as well as the most current aggregate information for our retirement systems. Most notably, the asset level is almost $220 billion as of December 31st. That retirement systems investment income for the calendar year ending December 31st was over $21 billion. We also provide background on the membership of the systems, where we have approximately 2.4 million active and annuitant members of public retirement systems across the state. We then move into a discussion of the guidelines for actuarial soundness, and as I previously noted, this was used as the litmus for whether or not a system's in a position to meet its long-term financial obligations. We provide some background on that. And then we go into a discussion of why using the amortization period as outlined by the PRB guidelines is an appropriate measure for this study. We also discuss funded ratio, which the committee did look at and take comment at one of its prior meetings, and tried to explain how funded ratio really is a measure at one moment in time, and two systems with the same funded ratios could be on two different trajectories, and that it really needs to be looked at concurrently with the amortization period. And we then go into talk about why the amortization period is important, how it is a product of the contributions made by, the benefits paid by, and investments made from the retirement system. So in line with the charge of the legislature, the feeling that this was the appropriate measure for the study. After determining that, we outline the amortization period ranges of the different retirement systems across the state. We've included 4 charts beginning on page 10 of your draft report. And as I mentioned, there are over 800, nearly 850 retirement systems in TMRS and 656 counties and districts in TCDRS. The first chart we present incorporates all retirement systems in the state, all 1,591 retirement systems, and their amortization period ranges based on the guidelines. The breakout is systems with infinite amortization periods. The next is systems who have amortization periods over 40 years but less than infinite. Those systems with amortization periods between 25 years and 40 years. Systems with amortization periods between 15 years and 25 years. Systems with amortization periods between greater than 0 but less than 15. And lastly, amortization period of 0. Those groupings correspond with the recommendation of the committee and our guidelines for actuarial soundness. The board recommends a range of 15 to 25 years, but 40 years is the minimum acceptable amortization period to meet the PRB guidelines. And so we've included those ranges for that reason.
Make a comment here. I think this is one of the more important points in our study. If you count every plan, which includes each individual county, each district, and each individual city, and you look at that, there's the first color, the block that includes those, it shows that there are 12 with an infinite amortization period and 14 more that have an at least 40-year amortization period. That's if you count all the plans in the system, and it is my opinion, I think it's accurate factually, that every city has its own plan in TMRS. Every county has its own plan in Texas County and District. That is, if they get in trouble, it's up to them to straighten out their trouble financially. They're not subsidized by other cities or other counties. So I think that technically the right way to explain what's happening in Texas is to include every one of those cities and every one of those counties in the discussion. Now, but if you look at the TCDRS, it shows that the number that have an infinite amortization period is 0. The number that have an at least a 40-year amortization period, but less than infinite, is 0. If you look at the TMRS, the Texas Municipal System, you find 0 in both places also. What that says is that our problem areas within the state of Texas are important, and we will focus on them in our guidelines, but it's not all the cities in TMRS, it's not all the counties and districts in TCDRS. So when you count all of systems, the number that have an infinite amortization period is 1% of the total group. For those with at least 40 years or less than infinity, it's another 1% of the whole group. So if you measure the whole group, it's very small. Now, when you back out the county and district and back out the municipal, and you're left with the 93 that we usually talk about, that's counting each one of those two big systems as one. Now you have 13% of the infinite group that the staff and board indirectly will be working on, and you have 14, which is 15% of the total with a 40-year amortization. So is it 1% or is it 15%? Depends on how you look at it. 1% is technically correct, but our goal is to deal with the ones who are only 15% of the ones that are the separate, to look at those that have the problems and counting the big county and district as one each and noting that they don't have a problem for us. Turn it back to you, Chris.
Thank you. And members, as outlined, we did present these different amortization charts to show, and as we footnoted, that the TCDRS and TMRS systems require their members to pay a certain rate to keep a maximum amortization period, and we provide more in-depth information in their respective appendices. But we did include that for TCDRS, their systems may not have an amortization period over 20 years, and in TMRS, the maximum is 30 years. As we move into our key findings, and as discussed, and when we broke it down to the 93 systems, there was a larger percentage of systems that were above the minimum 40-year standard. And so staff began to look back historically. This was a project that staff have been working on over the last year to identify the factors that have led to the significant shift in reported amortization periods. As you can see in the second table on page 12, that in 2000 there were 24 systems that had a 0 amortization period, essentially no unfunded liability. Today there's only one system that reports a 0 amortization period. Additionally, there's been an increase in the number of systems over 40 years. So staff began to review all the historical information, the actuarial, financial, investment, demographic, benefit information available to us as well. We did more in-depth analysis. We did correlation analysis on certain factors to really try to identify in our key findings what affected the systems and the reason that we have so many more systems with amortization periods over 40 years. Obviously, there are some obvious factors given the market performance of the last 14 years. We did look at the investment side, but I will go into the key findings right now that we've identified if the members don't have any additional questions at this point.
Go ahead.
The first key finding, and I think the most significant that we found, and I'll explain that over the next few findings, is the need for adequate contributions. We identified that public retirement systems that consistently received adequate funding are in a better position to meet their long-term obligations than systems that have not. Essentially, based on the results of our correlation analysis, we found the strongest correlation to a system's amortization period is the percent of its annual required contribution, its ARC, that was funded. As we show in the table by amortization group, and I would like to note that the ARC is a GASB standard that will be changing, no longer required to be reported, but for the time period we looked at, it was required. There was a change from a 40-year ARC to a 30-year ARC that affected all systems, so the percent change should be equal across all systems. They're all affected equally. But what we identified was, and you can see in the groups going from infinite all the way down to the 1 to 15, that the percents are much stronger and much higher for systems that have lower amortization periods. And as you'll note, we did not include, at the request of the committee at our last meeting, the one system that had a zero amortization period in the following charts because it was identified that it was a bit confusing because there was only one system. We did include a footnote on that. Additionally, we did find that funding requirements are higher now than they were in 2000, and the increase in funding requirements is greatest for systems at risk of not meeting their long-term obligations, i.e. systems with the longest amortization periods. Under finding 2, you can look and see in 2000, the average ARC as defined by the employer's required funding was in the 11 to 12% range across all amortization groups. Today there's a variation that's more significant, and you can see the increase is higher for systems that have longer amortization periods. Moving on to our third finding, we found that systems that have the longest amortization periods have had the steepest decline in their funded ratios. Again, we compared back to 2000, and we identified across those amortization groups the change in the average funded ratio. Finding number 4 evaluated the asset to liability growth, which is essentially another way of looking at the funded ratio, the rate that assets grow in ratio to the liabilities. And we identified that systems that had higher asset to liability ratios were in a better position to meet their long-term obligations and had lower amortization periods. Our fifth finding focuses on non-investment cash flow. Non-investment cash flow is defined as the difference between annual contributions less annual benefits paid and expenses. It does not account for investment income. We did identify that systems with higher non-investment cash flow are generally in a better position to meet their long-term obligations. The systems that had longer amortization periods, though, very few of them had average cash flows that were outside recommended ranges. We would typically identify an average over a period of time of negative 5% non-investment cash flow to be a possible precursor of financial trouble. There are a very limited number of systems that are in that place. On the whole, Texas retirement systems have cash flow that is within acceptable ranges. And again, as we note in here, slightly negative cash flow is the desired aim of pre-funding your retirement system. Having negative cash flow is not a problem, and again, one of the reasons you build up your trust fund is so you put less pressure on contribution requirements. So that we do note that in there. Although we did identify that there are a few systems that have a negative cash flow that is within a range that would pose a potential concern down the road. We did evaluate benefit enhancements, but what we did identify is no matter what level of benefit changes were enacted by retirement systems, the most important factor was that a retirement system received proper funding of those benefit enhancements. What we identified was that there were systems within all ranges of the amortization period that provided benefit enhancements over the last 15 to 20 years. The difference was the ones that received adequate funding for those benefit enhancements were in a better position to meet their long-term obligations.
Just a comment there, Chris. So how do you receive proper funding? Well, the core issue is a governance, a funding governance. Do you have an ability to enforce legally a requirement of proper funding? And if I had to sort of summarize one thing that happens very well in the county and district system and in the Texas municipal system, is that they have, excuse me, they have a particular, when you want to increase benefits in county and district or in municipal, you pay for it at that time. They say, here's how much more you need to contribute to have a certain kind of COLA, as an example. And that same tightness of here's what you want, here's what you have to pay, is not working as well for a lot of some of our other systems, and that's a core problem. And as Chris has said, that's why we're falling behind the arc, or what an actuary would say a proper rate is, but not in those two systems. So if you want to drill deeper into, well, here are two systems that it's working, and why is it working there, and is there anything we can do with the other systems to move them in that direction?
Members, the next key finding focused on demographics. In the historical analysis, we identified that there has been a reduction in the ratio of active to retired members since 2000. Overall, in 2000, the ratio was 3.67 active members for every retiree. Today, that's 1.99 active members for every retiree. The decline was steepest in systems with infinite amortization periods, as well for civilian systems. Lastly, the last key finding we focused on, as I mentioned, was investment performance. And what we looked at was, as reported to the PRB in the new PRB 1000s, for the systems that did provide that information, which for this report was about 85% of systems had reported that. For systems where we didn't receive that information, we provided a calculation based on the IRS IRR internal rate of return model, which we footnoted. But we did look at investment performance, and what we identified was that investment performance varied across amortization groups, and compared to the assumed rate of return, plans with longer amortization periods tended to have a better performance compared to their assumed rate of return than systems with lower amortization periods. This is not to say that poor investment performance allows a retirement system to meet its long-term obligations, but what we identified in our correlation analysis also showed correlation to was that strong investment performance will not offset the lack of adequate contributions over time. Essentially, even though you could be meeting or beating your assumed rate of return, if over a long period of time you do not receive adequate contribution levels, your system will eventually experience a deterioration in its financial health. And ultimately, we felt that was a point we wanted to make, and the way we've organized these findings is to start with the contribution finding, which was our strongest, walk through the other ones, and then again end with this finding, because we really think it brings to a head the idea that obviously if you assume a certain investment performance, you need to meet that. However, in lieu of sufficient contributions, good investments will not sustain a system over the long term.
You can't invest your way out of a problem caused by not contributing enough.
And that was, again, another finding that was detailed in our correlation analysis. We did include appendices with additional historical information, again, in the interest of trying to keep the main part of this report under 20 pages, knowing that our ultimate audience will be the legislature and their staff. We didn't want to produce a report that took 50 pages to get to our key findings. And so we've tried to condense that as best as possible. We've referenced the appropriate appendices throughout. And so that essentially, skipping ahead of the recommendations for just a minute, the remainder of your report, I believe pages 20 through maybe 109, I think is the last page, include a variety of appendices, and I'll just briefly go through. Appendix A contains the current actuarial evaluation information for all systems, including their current amortization period, as well as their prior actuarial report that they have on file with the Pension Review Board. Appendix A3 also provides additional supplemental actuarial information that the committee had requested we present. Appendix B provides information that walks through contribution and benefit decision making. What it outlines, and as we talked about where we identified sufficient contributions as the most important factor in meeting your long-term obligations, it really walks through in governing statute and enabling statute for each system who controls these different areas. Employer contribution, employee contribution, levels of benefits, increases, reductions, as well as contains information regarding Article 66 of the state constitution, which protects vested accrued benefits and whether or not the system is governed by that. Moving into Appendix C, this is where the additional information for Texas County and District is contained. Again, we'd like to thank them for working with us and promptly providing a lot of information that we requested. Appendix D covers the Texas Municipal Retirement System, and we want to thank them as well. You'll notice that these are long, in-depth appendices that have each individual system within those two systems, their actuarial information presented, including their funded ratio, their amortization period, their employer match, and their employee contribution rate. There's, again, 844 active systems within TMRS and 656 active systems within county and district. So those are quite long appendices, but given that all legislators will have plans in their districts covered by these systems, we thought it was very important to make sure that information was included. Appendix E provides...
Before you leave that one comment there, Chris, I would encourage the board members and particularly staff members as they work with members of the legislature and their staff to in all cases at least make them aware of the financial condition of the cities and the counties in their area. And the fire department, for example, if I were talking, or if a staff member was talking to somebody from Amarillo, Potter County, or Randall County, to talk about the situation in Amarillo of the City of Amarillo plan, that's in TMRS, the Potter County and the Potter County, Randall County status, that's in the county and district retirement. We also have in here the Amarillo Firefighters Fund, talk about that, and then talk about the statewide responsibilities to the Texas teachers, the Texas state employees. But make sure they understand home base, and for those, and there's good views there, and but it's important news. It's important that they know all of the plans that are in their home area, and they may in the past not have, I mean, that information is all there with the systems, but this is a place they can go that will tell it, sort of pull it all together if they want to look for it.
Members, moving to the next appendix, after the TCD and TMRS appendix, Appendix E contains contribution information for all the 93 retirement systems and a comparison between the rates in 2000 and the rates today. Appendix F is the additional historical information charts that are discussed in the meat of the report. Appendix G details our correlation analysis that the staff performed, walks through the factors that were examined and the most significant findings that we identified. Appendix H provides information for systems that have amortization periods over 30 years, what the projected additional contributions necessary to achieve various amortization periods is. For instance, if a retirement system had an infinite amortization period currently, what would be the additional contribution requirements to achieve a 25-year amortization period, a 30-year amortization period, or a 40-year amortization period? Appendix I provides information on the sponsors of those systems. Staff researched the general fund expenditures of those sponsors. For instance, the state of Texas, we looked at the general fund expenditures last year and compared that to the shortfalls of those retirement systems as a percent of the general fund expenditures. We did want to note and included here, and it was a comment raised, that for some systems, the general fund expenditures are only a portion of the funding that the system receives, but the committee, in looking at this, decided that for a baseline comparison, that they wanted to include that across all the sponsors, but we did include information identifying that that's not going to be the case for all sponsors. Additionally, Appendix J walks through actuarial assumptions and methods used by the public retirement systems across the state, including their investment rate of return, inflation assumption, actuarial cost methods, asset methods, amortization methods, and payroll growth assumption. Appendix K contains a short glossary of actuarial terms. And then our last appendix is the legislation that required all the work that we've been presenting here on House Bill 13. Walks through Section 7 and includes all the language included in House Bill 13 directing the Pension Review Board to conduct this study. And as we will get into later, this is the preliminary report. The board was asked to produce a report by September 1st. From this point on, the retirement systems covered in the report are to be provided a reasonable opportunity to comment on this. We'll get into in a future agenda item. And then the board may adjust its findings and recommendations based on those comments. The final report is due to the legislature by December 31st of this year. At this point, I'll stop and take any questions or comments from the board, and then we can move into the actual recommendations.
Committee members, do you have any comments?
My first comment is somebody did a lot of work and it's a very good job. I appreciate the information.
Mr. Chairman, I would say that at the risk of overstating it, I think this is a report for the ages. This is really an incredible report, and I would commend Bob May, who chaired the actuarial committee and oversaw this, as well as the staff. The quality and quantity of the work in this report, I think, really is remarkable. Really appreciate the help from the TMRS and the TCDRS. The narrative does an excellent job of laying out the issues for non-experts. And there's an enormous amount of information in here for pension junkies who really want to get into the details, and I know there are pension junkies in this room. There are a number of materials in here that I would consider standing reference materials, including Appendix B1, which was no small amount of work, I think, for staff to prepare, but I hope that can become part of the standard reporting information from this from the Pension Review Board. And so I would just commend the staff and Chairman May for their work on this report. Thank you.
Andrew, you have anything else?
I do not.
I would echo the comments made by Keith. This is a preliminary report. We're putting it out to the public. We're looking for comments. And so no doubt it can possibly get better, but it's a very, very good report, very thorough, reflects a lot of work. You know, a lot of thanks are owed to Bob, Keith, and Andrew for the time they spent in putting together, for Chris and his staff for developing this and moving forward, and for the plan community in terms of the input and attending these committee meetings and helping along the process. I think it's something that the state of Texas can use and will be helpful for the legislature. I also think it's something that other states and other locations could use and take a look at in terms of having general information and something that would be helpful on a moving forward basis.
Okay, members, to move on, and what we've done in your board packets, given that there are several pages between the drafted recommendations and the additional ones, we've added behind the green page before tab 5, we've re-put or duplicated the recommendations that are currently included in the preliminary draft, as well as additional recommendations. And all of these were discussed by the committee at its August meeting, and the committee asked the staff to present all of this information to the board. Ultimately, the legislation requires the board to include recommendations in the report. and we have included in some cases, ones that were a consensus agreement by the committee, and some we were asked to include for placeholder. If it's acceptable to the members, I'll start with the first item, which was the most significant recommendation. And there are essentially three versions of this recommendation. One, under recommendations on your page 17, your duplicated page, the funding policy to establish an adequate contribution rate. On the additional pages, we have two other versions of it, and I'll walk the members through what these represent, and the committee members can also provide a little bit more background and give the board an opportunity to look at this. As we identified, the adequate and sufficient contributions over the long term played the most significant impact in a system being able to meet its long-term obligations. The recommendation was that systems and their sponsors should work together to establish a funding policy for adequate contributions. The recommendation, as it's drafted in the report, focused specifically on establishing a contribution level to pay what we're calling an actuarially determined contribution. As GASB is now moving away from the ARC, it will no longer be required. And actually, the fiscal year that ended June 30th will be the first reporting cycle where GASB will move to 67, and the ARC will no longer need to be reported. So this recommendation stands that the systems and sponsors should establish this contribution policy in line with an ADC to maintain an amortization period at the minimum level recommended in the PRB guidelines. It goes on to say if the sponsor cannot fund the ADC, that the sponsor and the system should work together to identify, either through additional contribution policy or plan design, changes that can be enacted to achieve funding at the ADC level. We did want to note and include in there that there may be some systems whose contributions are fixed either through state law or city ordinance, and that the sponsor and the system should, in the cases where that is not sufficient to meet an ADC, look at either legislative or local action to enact changes. That is the recommendation as discussed at the committee, and they directed the staff to include this version in the report for now. If you go to the page under additional recommendations for consideration, there are two alternative versions of a contribution policy. The first one was based on House Bill 3356 last session, filed by Representative Caligari, who is also the sponsor and author of House Bill 13. Slightly amended. What this recommendation focuses on is the retirement system sponsor and system adopting a funding policy to achieve and maintain a minimum amortization period in accordance with PRB guidelines. It states that systems should notify the sponsor if the system receives an actuarial evaluation that shows it does not meet the minimum amortization period within PRB guidelines. And then, in line with what was in House Bill 3356, although that focused on a different funding standard, if a system receives 3 consecutive evaluations that identifies that it's not within the minimum amortization period, that the sponsor and the system develop a corrective action plan to address that, and that corrective action plan should include steps to ensure that the system receives adequate funding in accordance with the PRB guidelines for actuarial soundness. This moves a little bit farther beyond the original recommendation, including prescribing the steps and time frame for submitting a corrective action plan, but stops short of prescribing what that needs to include or actuarial standards. It is still very fluid and allows the system and the sponsor some flexibility and some time. In some cases, one valuation may show the system over 40 years. We identified the need to allow systems and their sponsors to take a wait-and-see approach. The idea was that 3 valuations would probably be a sufficient period. If you're not meeting the PRB guidelines over that period, that it's time for the system and the sponsor to probably look at corrective action steps. The second additional recommendation, and the third for funding policy, was brought up at a committee meeting in June, and it focuses on a law passed in the state of Tennessee, which requires local retirement systems not within their TMRS, Tennessee Municipal Retirement System, systems that are not included in that are required, and their sponsors are required to pay essentially what is the ARC, or in this case, the actuarially determined contribution rate. It sets forth a period where if you cannot make that required contribution, you have 6 years to adjust contributions or plan design to be in a position to meet that. It also further stipulates actuarial requirements to determine those ADCs, including specific asset smoothing methods, acceptable actuarial assumptions and methods. In Tennessee, there is a requirement that if a city or a county does not pay the ADC within that 6-year time, that the state would then make that payment for them through their local aid. That's not possible in the state of Texas, and certainly something that I think goes beyond the scope of the Pension Review Board. So we did not include that language. But we did want to provide for the board to consider, and at the request of the committee, these 3 variations of a funding policy recommendation. Again, we've included in the draft of the report probably the one that is least prescriptive in its recommendation, and then ramps up through the 2 additional recommendations.
Chris, we'll want to look more carefully at the Tennessee plan to be sure what I say now is correct, but I believe there was a final step. If the state had paid money to the various cities for their underfunding, then the state in Tennessee has the authority to get that money back from the city through other city sources. I believe, we need to double check that, because that's not what we're saying now Tennessee did, and I'm not sure I'm right on that. Keith, I don't know whether you remember or not, but it wasn't just the state's required to pay, that's it. It was the state has to pay, but then the state has the authority to get the money back from the cities in some other method.
Yeah, my understanding of the Tennessee law is that for a city or other political subdivision that chronically fails to pay its required contribution, the state has the authority to divert monies that otherwise would have gone to the city directly to the pension fund.
And members, I guess in looking at Texas law, I'm not sure that would be feasible, or actually I don't think that's possible.
Right. Yeah.
So
we just need to think about how we've said that, and if we say it, it'll be just talking about what Tennessee did. And you're right, Chris. We need to talk about more how we want to say that.
Well, we did not include that language because Texas does not have a mechanism that allows for that, so we stopped short of including that language in the text of the recommendation.
So let's pause here and talk about the recommendation and what we think should go into this report. I think the Tennessee law is interesting information, and maybe it's worth a footnote, even a footnote in the formal report, just to indicate something that another state is doing. But I think in terms of what we would seriously consider in terms of possibly putting the report, it would be in the current language in there, or possibly the 1B option, the paragraph, the top paragraph on this page of the alternatives, or a hybrid of the 2. And I guess I'd like some input from committee members. I mean, what was the discussion with respect to Caligari, the language based on Caligari's bill? I mean, because what was intriguing to me when I read that, I mean, this whole thing that the system should notify the governing body of the sponsor. The system receives an actuarial evaluation that shows the system does not meet the minimum amortization period in accordance with the PRB guidelines. I would think that should happen anyway, but it's maybe a good idea to put that in writing in terms of that's our recommendation, that somebody ought to send something in writing.
And members, just to that point, the only requirement in state law is that the system notify its own members. If it doesn't have a sufficient amortization period, it's not required in our law that they notify the sponsor. I think in most cases that probably is the case, but the only required notification is to the members of the system.
And of course, what we're doing there is no legal effect to it. There are only recommendations, and it would be up to the legislature to uply make a decision on whether or not that's going to be imposed in plans. But to me, a recommendation that if you're getting an actual evaluation, you might as well tell the sponsor where you are. I think that's a sound idea.
I do too.
And so I would think at least the language that's in our current report, we probably maybe want to add that type of concept to what's in there.
Yeah, it goes beyond what we're legally or what has been given, but I think certainly the plan sponsor, information to the plan sponsor is desirable. I think by and large they all get that information anyway, but I think that should be, we ought to say it anyway.
So then the other concept that was in this sort of 1B option was the whole idea that if you receive 3 consecutive valuations indicating system funding is not sufficient, the sponsor and the governing body would provide a written corrective action plan. Now, I mean, that's also an interesting idea. I don't think it's necessarily overreaching. But I wasn't sure, like, for one thing that came immediately to mind to me was, well, how would that possibly work with state plans? I mean, the sponsor is the state of Texas, the legislature. I mean, I'm not sure we're in a place where would we want to impose something on them, and then you're in a situation where you have, and it looks to me like you took a lot of pains to maybe not have differentiating on certain levels between state plans and other plans. So I don't know if, I'm just throwing this up for discussion, whether people think there's maybe some thought about putting some type of mechanism like this in here, or do we just, if this came from something a legislature proposed, maybe we just leave it in their realm if they want to pursue it, but at least wanted to discuss it.
I would say that if there is a statewide retirement system that is in need of a corrective action plan as prescribed in here, chances are that system is going to have one already. And I don't believe that it would be overreaching. Obviously, it's ultimately the legislature's purview, but I don't think it would be overreaching to expect any retirement system to provide a corrective action plan.
I agree.
Members, just to provide a little bit more background, the guidelines for actuarial soundness also have a adopted board policy for monitoring systems that continually don't meet the guidelines, and that does include staff level communications, movement towards the actuarial committee reviewing, and then ultimately the board has the discretion to ask the system, and has historically happened, hasn't recently, due to all the other work, have a system or a sponsor appear before the board or the committee. That is a policy that the board has adopted when it did its most recent update to the guidelines. So if there's any concern about having a state of Texas submit a report to the PRB, we could look at updating our own policies concurrently to address that as well. Just to provide a little bit more background to the members.
And as I believe we previously discussed, board members, we see an important reason to move forward with the practice that we did in the past, is where you have plans with an inadequate financing arrangement. We've already set up in past, this is old material for the Pension Review Board, but we just haven't followed through in recent years with, if somebody's got an infinite amortization period, first at staff level, our procedure says our staff actuary works with that system. Then if that doesn't bring movement towards a plan of action, then I believe it brings in the executive director and the board actuary. And then it could bring this all to the board, to us, where we would invite members from a city or a county and members of a board or chair of each to visit with us in Austin and discuss the problem they have and hear their recommendations for addressing their financial problem. Now that's been done by this board a lot in the past, not in the recent past. And so that's all set up to do, and we intend to start back into that probably this fall, certainly next spring.
What, any other members of the boards, Wayne, or anybody else have some thoughts about whether this is a good idea?
Do we have to make this decision today?
No.
Because this is a draft that we're sending out there for additional comment, right?
Correct.
I think I'd like to give some
additional thought. I agree that, and I don't know if, I think putting in this sentence about sort of the giving notice to the sponsor, I think we could probably add that to the draft that we're going to circulate. But maybe we don't add any additional language with respect to recommendation at this point what's going out in terms of circulating, and leave the language that was currently put into the report by the committee. But it's probably merits some consideration by the board and clearly we're putting it out for comment, so comment from the community that's reviewing this would also be appreciated.
Let me be sure I'm understanding what you two are saying we would say and we wouldn't say in this report. I think I lost your train of thought. Or Chris, maybe you got understood how we would rewrite this.
My understanding would be that we would include additional language in the draft report expressing that systems should notify the governing body of their sponsor if they receive evaluation does not meet the minimum standard, but that we would not include the language regarding the corrective action plan. I guess because of the comment period, I would add, I think we would want to consider whether or not to include that, because I think the comment period was intended to allow systems to see what the recommendations would be. If we're going to provide any changes to those recommendations beyond what we put out, we would probably need to provide additional comment period for the systems. I think the idea was that the report would go out in September, that the systems would then have a chance to review that. If we amend that after they've commented in an area that's not originally covered by what they've looked at, we would definitely want to give them an opportunity to look at that again before we would present the final report to the legislature.
So what you're suggesting, and maybe this makes sense, is put it both in there if we're thinking we might want it, because that'll give everybody a position to comment, and it's easier to edit something out as to edit something back, something new into it.
That is correct, and the board does have the ability to amend its findings based on the comments it receives, and certainly in talking to the different systems between now and the end of the comment period, if there is concern over that, we can bring that to the board, and at the December meeting, the board will approve a final version that would go to the legislature. So we can, if we get it in there and there's a desire to pull it back out, that certainly I think is a better approach than not including it now and then adding it later.
Well, the committee was the one who's been the closest to this. I mean, what kind of input did you have from other participants, or what are your thoughts on all this?
Mr. Chairman, I think that we need to move the ball forward here, and I think it's a very mild suggestion that the plan sponsor know about the condition of their pension plan. And if I'm not mistaken, the proposed threshold for notification is 3 consecutive valuations indicating a system funding is not sufficient to meet the requirements.
Not for the notice.
Okay, thank you.
It's for the written corrective plan is 3 consecutive.
Okay. I like the idea of putting some form of the notification to the plan sponsor and the corrective action plan into the draft report and seeing what kind of comments we get.
Anyone else have any other thoughts?
Yeah, Chris, I would think I would think we ought to, in addition to that, I agree we ought to move forward with this without further change, so we can get the comments from the various people who review it, and not have to delay a review process. I think in addition to that, I'm suggesting to Chris that he provide to the board the procedures that we already have set up that would trigger us doing individual reviews with individual plans that have an inadequate financing arrangement for the benefit of relatively newer board members who may not have seen or looked at that language we already have in effect, and for the older board members to look at again and say, are we still comfortable with what we already have as a process? Because I stepped across into saying, now we already have a process for interacting and inviting people to come to Austin to talk to the board if they've got an inadequate financing arrangement. We've had that for 15 years. But we ought to look at the language again. So I think I'd like, Chris, for you to send to all the board the existing language that we have. So if we have a problem with that, we can talk about it again as a board.
Absolutely.
I agree with moving forward with this.
Okay.
I have a question about this report. Was there any discussion within the committee or the staff to include the asset number as it relates to these 26 out of 93 plans?
Actually, that is in the Appendix A.
Okay.
We've broken out within the different groupings. The very bottom of Appendix A includes the asset value. So within the groupings, the infinite group, what the assets, and Appendix A1, actuarial value of assets, the accrued liabilities. So at the aggregate numbers, so for the infinite group of the 12 plans, there's approximately 33 billion. So that is in the appendix.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Well, if we're going to put part of this 1B into this, maybe let's just specifically talk about what we're saying so Chris will have clear guidance. So if we're looking on page 17, under 1, the recommendation, and it reads, according, the PRB recommends that the retirement system sponsor and the system should establish an adequate funding policy. At a minimum, the policy should establish a contribution level to pay the ADC. And then it goes on, if the sponsor cannot fund the ADC, the sponsor should work with the system to establish a framework whereby an adequate funding policy can be established, possibly through changes to the plan or contribution level. I guess it's, at what point, it seems like those first couple sentences would stay, but at what point would we add in, the 2 sentences we're talking about from this 1B option? I don't know if we added in after that sentence. Well, Chris, what do you think?
My original thought was after the guidelines for actuarial soundness, if it does not meet it, that the system notify the sponsor, and then if a sponsor cannot fund it, and we could go from there. And I think with the, if the board is interested in including any possible recommendation regarding, a possible corrective action plan, that it would probably be worked into those last couple of sentences of this recommendation, because obviously it would have to bear in mind whether a system would need legislative changes. Again, I think that's one of the issues raised with the state systems, is that they don't control their contribution rates. Those are set by the legislature. Benefit levels, again, are set by the legislature. The system, and in a lot of systems, as identified in Appendix B, may not have that ability. Additionally, we could amend the language under the corrective action plan to say, to determine one based on applicable state laws. I mean, certainly it'd be very difficult for the Board of ERS to develop a corrective action plan without working with the legislature. Staff could alter that language a little bit to make sure it speaks to kind of the reality of a lot of these systems are going through, or the sponsors who has control over that. But I would think right towards the end of that is, if the board wants to put something in, would be the place to do that.
Okay, so it sounds like you somewhat easily understand how you'll incorporate the concept with the system that says systems should notify the governing body of the sponsor if it receives an actual evaluation that shows the system does not meet the minimum requirements under our guidelines. And are you clear if the board gives you direction about this 3 consecutive valuations, how you incorporate that?
Yeah, I feel comfortable, and if the board would want, we could provide that language later this afternoon to the chair of the committee and the chair of the board for final approval before we would put this out at the end of the month.
Okay.
Is there a alternative phrase to corrective action plan?
We could look at language that would say to provide notification of any proposed changes a system or a sponsor may take to address systemic underfunding after 3 valuations, as opposed to corrective action plan, or to keep the pension review board aware of proposal. That would be a variation on a theme, so to speak.
I
You
would
have one
appreciate that.
concern with that term, corrective action plan.
At least I do. I mean, mind you, this is still a draft. But there's a negative connotation there that I'm a little uncomfortable with.
Might I?
It implies that systems have done something wrong that was under their control. And again, we're working with a draft. So it's, you know, I suppose it's all right here, but for the draft, but I'm going to need some guidance before I vote on this one.
Keith, did you have something you wanted to add?
Instead of, I'm sensitive to the corrective action plan nomenclature, and also that we are working with a draft. Might I suggest we say something along the lines of a plan of measures needed to restore the plan to long-term actuarial
Something like that
sustainability?
would be great. And, you know, Chris wasn't far off either.
Okay.
But something like that is great. Again, we're working with a draft, so.
And again, even if this draft were to become final with this concept in there, this is just a recommendation from this board and has no legal effect with respect to the plans and how they administer their own.
Yeah. Yes, but.
Well, and members, to address concerns before, and obviously we can work through this, staff can work up amended draft language and ensure that the appropriate board members have an opportunity to review it before it's included in the preliminary release. We're pretty much queued up to go back to the office and update the report as necessary this afternoon, so we can get that out to you before the end of the day with those.
I'm fine, at least from my end of it, just to, you know, let y'all work on it. I don't think I have to see it again. It's a draft, and catching me later on in the day may not be real easy.
And I guess as I was going to say, as noted before, I think editing language, improving how the report is written is something that we can work on this fall. I think changing the meat of the recommendations or findings, really, unless we receive specific comment to do so, or, you know, coming back in December, I think it would be, that would be where it would be problematic. But certainly we can, and there will probably be additional editing, and there's a lot of information in this report. We've tried to, as best we can, make sure we haven't missed anything. And again, we'd encourage folks who are providing comment, if you identify something that looks a little off or maybe not the most current data, to provide us that as well.
Chris, I'm wondering this, give me your thoughts procedurally. I know I haven't looked carefully at our present procedure that we passed several years ago as a board, and as it interacts with what we're saying in this report. Now, do I and do other board members individually, or maybe the actuarial committee, have time to do that over the course of the fall? I'm nervous about having time to really look carefully at the connectiveness or lack thereof between what we've said in the past and what we're saying in this report.
The policy includes just regular communications from the systems if there is a concern that the board, and the board's always had the ability to ask for more information. The policy as it was adopted in 2011 would be in line with this recommendation of communication, and at a certain threshold the board has the ability, even without the policy, to request more information or to request a written response in terms of steps that may be taken to address underfunding. So okay. These would work together as they're currently drafted.
Okay. Then was the idea that, Chris, that you would draft and that you would look to the chair and to me as chair of the committee to see what you've drafted on this issue we're discussing right now and get it out within a few days or today, or what were you saying, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the expectation would be that staff would provide, if it's amenable to the board, the language to the chair of the committee and the chair of the board, the updated language on any of these changes that those chairs would sign off on and we'd incorporate in. And the goal is to have it finalized by, I know it's a tight deadline, but probably by the end of the day tomorrow. So that it would be available for comment by the retirement systems. I think staff's in a great position to do that if the two chairs' schedules are amenable.
My schedule works for that.
Yeah, up until about noon tomorrow.
Well, certainly, we'd like to be out tomorrow before midnight, so certainly, if possible. But no, certainly, we can get that to you later this afternoon. And again, as a preliminary report, if there are edits or tweaks or comments from our constituents coming back, the board has the ability to look at that in December.
Okay, and that was actually, that whole discussion was on the first recommendation. I don't know if you want to go through the rest of them, or anybody else has more comments.
Yeah, but that was the good one.
And members, and that was the one we really, I think, and the committee had indicated we wanted the input from the full board on that, and I think that we'll incorporate those comments in what we provide the two chairs. Moving forward, the next area of recommendations focus on disclosure and reporting, and really highlight the change GASB's making and the fact that the required arc of GASB is no longer going to be included in reports as GASB moves from funding to disclosure requirements. So the recommendations under 2 focus on, because its adequate contributions are so significant, that systems valuation should adequately disclose contribution levels needed to achieve appropriate amortization periods, and to some degree, we defer to the systems, but we provide examples, either at 25, 30, and 40-year rates, which some systems do, or some a 10, 20, and 30-year rate. And that the governing body of the system and the sponsors should also get this information. Essentially, if you're at an infinite amortization period, we believe the valuation should disclose at a minimum what it would take to get to 40, possibly 30, and 25. That's not that difficult for an actuary to include in the report, and we do have that additional information. We believe that also should be provided to the governing body of the system and the sponsor, and that the system valuation should also disclose the actual contributions made by the sponsor. Those are the core recommendations that the committee looked at. There was, under the additional recommendations, some discussion about whether or not to require additional disclosure beyond the GASB standards regarding disclosure of drop balances and their value relative to the accrued liabilities. Again, that was something I think the committee looked at, but because it went beyond the new current GASB standards, we hadn't worked that into the body of the report at this point.
Does anyone have any other questions or comments on the recommendations?
I guess looking to the board, that the general sense would be not to include that additional recommendation at this point.
Right, I don't think there's any consensus to change what's currently in the plan.
Well, I'm sorry, what did you say? We would leave it in or take it out?
We've got it as a separate, I guess the question is, does the board want to move that into the body of the report, that additional drop disclosure language under the additional recommendations 2A?
I would support putting it into the draft.
It's certainly been in the headlines for one of our member plans lately. Sensitivity over the enormous amounts of money within a drop within a plan.
Well, and especially in light of Chris's comment that it's better to put it in and then make edits out as opposed to trying to change things and not giving opportunity to talk.
All right, the next area of recommendations focus on benefit decisions, and as we noted before, well, first off, we didn't analyze or evaluate the appropriateness of certain benefit levels. That was beyond the scope of this study, and as we note, it's best made by local systems or local sponsors. However, what we did identify was that adequately funding benefits is essential to maintaining your long-term health. Under 3, we have different 3 recommendations in the report. One is that the PRB recommends that the cost of benefit changes, including multipliers and the granting of COLAs, should be actuarially valued prior to adoption to ensure additional costs will be funded adequately and continuously, and that such benefit changes should only be granted if they can be properly funded after adoption and amortized in accordance with the PRB guidelines. The second item under that addresses concern over pension spiking, defines it as a process where the compensation is inflated immediately prior to retirement in order to receive a larger pension. And again, note that because those are not always captured in the actuarial evaluation, sometimes that significant pension spiking can create unforeseen costs that are not properly valued and paid for. And then lastly, and a lot of our systems have already addressed this by creating new tiers for new hires, but item C is a recommendation that if there are funding deficits that cannot be met over a period of time, that systems and sponsors look at possible benefit provision modifications. And again, I think numerous systems in Texas have taken the lead on this and established new tiers within their plans. And so that that is something that we've included in a recommendation under benefit provisions. Moving on, the fourth area focuses on actuarial assumptions. And obviously, actuarial assumptions drive the projected costs. And the first recommendation, A, is that retirement systems at regular intervals and within their budgetary considerations, obviously some systems may need to monitor their administrative expenses and may not be able to do them as frequently, conduct actuarial experience studies to evaluate their assumptions versus actual experience, and to update their assumptions where necessary to ensure that they are accurately projecting their future costs. The second portion, with the same idea of budget considerations, is for systems and sponsors to look at conducting actuarial audits to ensure that the accuracy of their actuarial work is sound and precise. And those conclude the two areas under actuarial assumptions, and we're at the end of kind of the core recommendations. If you move to the second part of the additional recommendation, there were a few other items discussed and we've presented here. Item 3 under additional recommendations focuses on stress testing and solvency analysis and would recommend that systems conduct these studies to understand their ability to meet their long-term obligations under different outcomes relating to investment return and actuarial demographic experience. This would essentially recommend that a retirement system look at what would happen if you're assuming 8% if you got 10% over the next 10 years or 6% over the next 10 years. So you have an idea of different investment return experience, what it would do to the overall funding of the system, as well under different actuarial situations, higher rates of retirement, different mortality rates. So that recommendation is essentially what we would look at as stress testing and solvency analysis. We also looked at, the committee did a recommendation related to pooled or grouped trust funds. Two recommendations. One focuses on giving consideration to allowing systems to voluntarily form or create group pooled or trusts, specifically for smaller systems to take advantage of economies of scale. The second portion the committee looked at encouraging eligible systems to consider joining TMRS or TCDRS, obviously taking into consideration that there may be specific laws governing allowing systems to do that. But again, that was an item that the committee had looked at. And lastly, the item 5 was the idea of the development of a reserve or rainy day fund to help offset potential investment costs. I think there were some systems, particularly TCDRS, that had a reserve fund that helped mitigate the losses of 2008 and 2009. And certainly, as we include in the language that you have to balance the desire to be properly funded in paying your ADC, it would be something that you would not necessarily have to be 100% funded, as is TCDRS did through their policy to establish a reserve fund. But we did want to state there probably needs to be a balance, particularly for systems that may have infinite amortizations currently, may not be in a position to start developing such a reserve fund. So those were the additional recommendations that the committee discussed. And certainly if the board would like to move any of those into the preliminary draft, certainly we'd look for direction from the board at this point.
Well, the one that I found somewhat intriguing was the 4B. And of course it has to be if they're legally allowed to do that type of thing, but you know, encouraging eligible systems, smaller systems to join TCDRS or TMRS to the extent they can, to me might make a certain amount of sense just because of cost efficiencies and those type of things. But that's the one that caught my eye a little bit, but I'd appreciate input from other people.
It's a good point, and I agree with that those are two good systems for them to look at. I think they probably already are. I think talk about a small town, my mother's hometown of Gunter, Texas, north of Dallas, and if they have 5 employees, then they already be in TMRS. I think the place they would naturally look is to Texas Municipal Retirement. But I mean, it's certainly good to put it in the report, but I think it's already happening. And county and district, I think, casts a wide net around the state. So fortunately, I think that's already happened.
So do we factually know if there are some systems, small systems out there that could be a part of these that aren't?
I don't factually know.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've got all, I mean, because certainly those two systems have requirements to join, and I think clearly one of the most important requirements is achieving the certain amortization period. There's probably a transition of benefit levels. Again, it may be more complicated than just a simple recommendation. We did talk about it, and I think that came up. The idea was at least to get it before the board for consideration, and I think the point made is I think those systems are probably already aware of it. And I guess the way we've drafted is, to encourage where possible, to at least to look at it. But again, there was discussion of pooled or group trusts, and as raised at the committee meeting, we do have two systems that function in that capacity, so we did want to add that language in for the board to look at.
Well, I don't feel that strongly about it in light of this discussion, because if there are systems out there who aren't, clearly they must be aware of these two safe systems, and as part of their own fiduciary duty, they'd be taking their own analysis of whether it makes sense to join them. So I don't really feel like we necessarily have to do it. If it is more complex, we can let them figure out how to do it. Any other
So
comments?
are you saying, Paul, you would not,
We can leave it out.
you would leave it out?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I would consider recommendation number 3 and 5 to be industry best practices, and we should consider including them.
Which 2 or 3 and 5?
The stress testing and solvency analysis, number 3, and the consideration of establishing a reserve or rainy day fund.
Yeah.
I agree with you that I'm on national committees that are debating those points now, and I think we should, they're right on point of something that I think we should mention.
So the rainy day fund would mean you're at 100% funded, and then you're setting aside more money?
You're setting aside money in a contingency.
Right? I mean, so you're a city that has a plan, and the plan's 100% funded, and you're going to say, okay, city, give more money, so then that plan has a reserve fund setting aside as a rainy day fund?
Well,
You don't need to be funded at 100% to establish a rainy day fund. And the Texas County and District Retirement System has a very good story to tell about the use of their rainy day fund, in which they used it during the recent market decline in 08 and 09, and used it to substantially blunt the effects of the 08-09 market decline, keeping their contribution rates for their plan members.
But how is that different than they had that money, I mean, as opposed to just putting it in?
It reduced, because when you reach a certain funding level, and exactly where that is, I'm not sure, but certainly over 100%, you get increased political pressure to increase benefits. And by putting it into a rainy day fund, you're sort of taking it out of the main pot and reducing the appeal of trying to use that money to reduce contributions below a level at which they responsibly should, or to increase benefit levels.
And just to elaborate a little bit, I think in TCDRS's case, it was investment surpluses over a certain threshold were not necessarily smoothed in on the smoothing period. They were set aside and saved to offset investment losses in the future. And the thought process was it would smooth the arc out for their member cities. So the arcs may not come down as much in the good times because of investment gains, because you hold a portion of it back, but then arcs don't have to come up as much in bad times to help offset that. At least with TCDRS's case, that's how they utilize the reserve fund.
You could rename it stabilization fund.
Yeah, the stabilization or contingency fund. Looking back over the period from about 1995 forward, when a plan would, through its actuary, get its amortization period down to 15 or 20 or maybe even 25 years, they would say, all right, this is good, this is time to increase benefits. If there was a policy in that plan to say this is a time to put some money into a reserve fund, a rainy day contingency fund, before you increase benefits, then you would have mitigated some the hard fall in 2008 when the market dropped a lot. And so it's saying the idea of rainy day funds is a pretty new idea. I mean, that is certainly catching on among actuaries nationally, and I think it's important to lay out at least the idea. This is very simple, brief comment. It takes a lot of refinement and thought, or would, between a particular system and its actuary. But I think it's one of the stronger things that the actuarial community believes should be done.
It will present problems to the trustees in that there will be participants that see that as a fund that ought to be used.
Yeah.
It should be given to retirees.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got other legitimate purposes, so you've got a real push-pull here, but if our job is
So on the conservative side, it's a good thing.
Well, let's go through this so that staff can have direction. So it sounds like 2, we got consensus. We were going to probably want to put 2 in. And again, I'm looking at, I'm sure everybody's on the same page in terms of this page 2 of the insert that Chris was referring to, and the additional recommendations. The 2 is the disclosure and reporting. Number 3 is stress testing and solvency analysis, which Keith recommended right now that we put into the preliminary report. And I'm okay with that. I don't know if anybody wants to discuss that, but that makes a certain amount of sense. So 4, we'll just go ahead and leave out. Is that the consensus? Which
Is that the one referencing TMRT?
the pooled or group trust funds. One is to consideration should be given to allowing systems to voluntarily create a pool or group trust fund. The other one is the TMRS or TCDRS. I'm okay with. I'm okay either way actually, because I think they.
I guess I don't really understand why you would leave it out. I mean, what's the risk of you just putting it in there? I mean, it's a recommendation. It's a good recommendation, I think. If they haven't thought about it, then they'll think about it.
I might suggest that we consider 4A and adding a little bit of language on 4A that addresses the fact that economies of scale can benefit a retirement system by reducing their costs and increasing their returns. And if we look at the results in this report, we see that the very small systems did experience notably lower investment returns and have higher investment costs. Skip 4B, but I think that a little bit of elaboration on 4A, just suggesting that if you are a very small public pension plan, you might consider combining your resources with one or more other plans in order to lower your costs and possibly improve your returns.
Or along those lines with 4A, if you just said, when you say voluntary create or join, maybe that gets you into the concept under 4B right there.
Sure. I would like to see you leave in the TMR and THCD as options within that.
And we could kind of merge the language so it's just a single recommendation under that, but identifies both A and B. Okay,
well, and I'm fine with putting it in too. Again, because it's a preliminary draft and we want comment from the community, it's better to put it in. Okay, so then now we're down to 5 on the rainy day fund. And I'll just get a feel for the board. I mean, I think Bob and Keith are both saying, yeah, put it in.
Keith's explanation appealed to me, so I would support keeping it in, putting it in.
Are you okay with that, Leslie?
Yes.
Okay. So I think we've gone through all the recommendations, right?
Yes, I think that staff, with the board's changes, I think we can look at a...
I understand your point's well taken, Paul, but so is Keith's.
Right, and again, it doesn't mean that, this is, again, to put out there for discussion.
And members, we'll look at the time frame for comment, and certainly the idea would be that we'll receive the comments back from our constituents and bring those to the board and work through a process to see what the final report would or would not include.
Okay, so any further questions or discussion on this item? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion to approve the preliminary report after incorporating the comments from the board that we discussed, containing the findings of the study, the financial health of public retirement systems in the state, including the recommendations as agreed to on how a public retirement system may mitigate risk of not meeting its long-term financial obligations as required by Section 7 of House Bill 13 of the 83rd Legislature.
I'll make a motion to that effect.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. May, seconded by Mr. Roberts. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so the next item is 7C, establish a comment period for public retirement systems, submit a response to the board as required by Section 7E of House Bill 13, 83rd Legislature. Chris.
And members, again, as required by the legislation, the systems covered in this report are provided an opportunity to review the findings and recommendations and provide comment if they choose. The board can consider those comments in amending its report before final submission by December 31st. And currently, the next board meeting is scheduled as December 17th. Staff have looked at this, and I think as far as official comments, we'd identified possibly either October 15th or November 1st as giving us enough time, and we may need to have an actuarial committee meeting to review depending on the amount of comments received and issues that are raised to provide staff a chance to work through that process, notify the committee and the members, and kind of work through how we're going to amend the final report. So we did want to at least present those two possible dates to the board. I think at least with October 15th, that provides about 6 weeks for systems to review this. November 1st would probably be, from my point of view, kind of a drop-dead date that we would absolutely have to have, substantive comments on the report itself. So we did want to present those two as possible dates for the board to consider, but it is required to provide systems a reasonable opportunity to comment.
And the idea is once you get comments from systems, then you, like you said, you might have a committee meeting before the board meeting to sort of mull through them and figure out what the committee's final recommendation would be?
I think that would be the appropriate process to go through.
And then whatever our final recommendation is, accompanying our report would be those comments from them. So the legislature is going to get to see the comments that we either read and rejected or read and accepted.
Yeah, all comments, as noted, are required to be included. It's somewhat like a management response in an audit. So we'll add an appendix. There'll be more pages added to the report. So the more comments we get, the longer the report will be. We could probably get up to 150 or 200 pages possibly.
Chris, timing-wise, between the 15th of October and the 1st of November, you're also continuing to receive more current actuarial evaluations, and you're going to be updating that in your report. Does that make a difference one way or the other between the 15th and the 1st?
Well, I think with the new data, we're probably going to work with the systems, particularly the statewide systems whose fiscal years end this weekend, to provide them beyond that to get updated data in. But I think for the comments on the actual substantiveness of the report, the findings and the recommendations, that would be separate. We'll work with the individual systems on making sure we have their most current data as far as whether they're meeting our guidelines or not. We're not going to change the historical analysis for a few additional reports that are received. However, if there's a system, we'll say ERS, for instance, that is currently listed at infinite, if they get their new valuation comes in and shows them at 20 years, we want to make sure that's updated in our final report. Obviously, those, particularly the statewide systems who will be working directly with the legislature, we will provide them a little bit more opportunity for current data, but I'm viewing that separately as comments on what's in the report.
What do you recommend, the 15th or the 1st?
Well, I think to give Chris enough time and enough time for your committee meeting, I'd be tending more towards the 15th.
I agree.
Because you're going to have the time to digest them, you're going to have the time to schedule, make sure everybody can get for a committee meeting, and then you have to do it all in time for us to see something for a December board meeting. I would suggest the 15th.
I agree. That gives them 6 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Any further discussion? Yeah. So I would entertain a motion to provide public retirement systems until October 15th to provide a response to the board on the preliminary report, final financial health study as required by Section 7 House Bill 13.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. And I'm sorry, that motion was made by Mr. May and seconded by Mr. Brainerd?
Yes, sir. No, Mr. Roberts.
Whatever.
I'm sorry, Wayne.
I have no pride of office.
Sorry, motion was made by Mr. Roberts. Second by Mr. Briggs. Okay, item 8, receive report from the Legislature Committee on the following items: the July 19th House Pensions Committee interim hearing, and the legislative appropriation request and August 12th joint budget hearing.
Yes, as you can guess, the activities around this building are picking up. Budget requests and hearings were conducted. We had the interim charge. I appreciate, Paul, you're sitting in on the LBB budget hearing. I normally like to do that, but I had a conflict, and it is very important to have board representation whenever a legislative entity is hearing us. So your time away from your day job, I appreciated in helping me out. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris to give the details of what's been going on.
Members, behind tab 5A, we have there were 2 charges heard on July 9th by the House Pensions Committee. One related to examining the new proposed GASB statements, and there were several panels that day. I was on one of the panels, and one of our board members was on actually the second panel. And we presented information to the committee. There was a discussion by the retirement systems, their sponsors, several experts on what's going on with GASB and its proposed changes, and we included in the packet the report that we submitted on GASB. As well, they also looked at the implementation of House Bill 13. I did talk briefly about everything the board has been working on over the last year, the study, the training, the development of conflict of interest and ethics policies, expanding our website, implementation of various programs, and gave the committee an update on that. And then there was the second part of the charge, was reviewing the agencies under the committee's jurisdiction, where I provided an update on the implementation of the sunset legislation. It was fairly quick. We were I was the first panel of the morning and the last panel of the evening. There were not a lot of questions by the end of the day on sunset. And, I will say I think the committee was generally very pleased with the work the board's been doing and meeting and exceeding the requirements and deadlines established by House Bill 13 and the sunset legislation. So that was kind of a brief overview, and there were some of the members were in attendance as well, or presenting if they had any additional comments they wanted to share on that interim hearing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And then briefly, as noted, with we had our joint budget hearing on August 12th. We did present that. That is the beginning process of the budget cycle. As noted, we will be gearing up, and there'll be obviously when we get to next session, we'll go engage in the actual budget hearings through Senate Finance and House Appropriations. But we did have that hearing on August 12th.
Back to the July meeting, I'll make one comment. I was encouraged that even though there's going to be a major change in terms of who's on the House Pension Committee, that there was a real good turnout that day. A real good actual participation of various members of the House at the meeting. I would not have predicted that.
Okay, good. Chris, do you have anything further? Anything further on item 8.2, the legislative appropriation request on August 12th?
Oh yeah, just to note, we've included the LAR in your packet. We are working with the LBB to do an update on our baseline. I think there was a slight discrepancy in one of the numbers, but nothing significant has changed with any of our exceptional item requests. It's just our baseline number was a little bit off. That number is provided by the governor's office and the LBB. So we had that in one area, but in another area we're just updating those figures to reflect that. But that will be resubmitted probably this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. But that doesn't change any of the process we've gone through or anything else that's in there.
Okay, good. Next item, item 9, review and discuss report from the executive director on the following matters. 9A, a report on the end of fiscal year 2014 budget. 9B, consider approval of fiscal year 2013 operating budget.
All right, members, behind tab 6A is the projected, we've got basically one more business day in the fiscal year. We start the new fiscal year next week. So we've essentially shown you the final projections. We've included, obviously, the projected costs for board travel for the members who've come here and the projected costs based on what we see. So that shows where we look to spend down to. Again, we were able to fulfill the requirements of House Bill 13. We've got the online training stuff moving, so I think we've done an excellent job of staying within our budget and being able to fulfill what we've been asked to do. So that's behind tab 6A. the members don't have any questions, I'll move on. Behind tab B is the proposed budget for fiscal year 2015. That is our operating budget that we're looking at going into the new fiscal year. We are projecting, and we do have costs built in as estimated now, obviously with the legislative session coming, possible board travel, committee meetings. We've tried to estimate as best we can. Certainly we will present updates for the board to approve as necessary, but this represents our best projection of our spending pattern for fiscal year 2015 at this point.
So did any of the board members have any questions on the fiscal year 2015 operating budget? No. Okay, if not, I would entertain a motion to approve the fiscal year 2015 operating budget as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Roberts, seconded by Mr. Mascale. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Next two items, I'll read both into the record, is 9C, 9D, agency organization structure and staffing, and 9D, 2014 annual TELFRA conference.
Members, and just to provide you, and I think we've had some vacancies created on our staff recently that we're in the process. We've posted those positions. We are kind of looking at, as our completed some of these programs and moving on to future programs, reviewing kind of our internal staff structure and organization, and just wanted to give the board a heads up that there may be some changes that I will forward to the board as soon as we've worked through that. We can do a full update at the December meeting, but we do currently have 2 vacancies on the staff. We have begun receiving applications and reviewing those. We're going to be scheduling our first round interviews next week to try to get those folks on board as quickly as possible, up to speed and trained. Obviously, with the legislative session not that far around the corner, we want to get everybody on our staff trained and ready to go as soon as possible. So we will have some new staff members at the next board meeting, and I will provide the board updates on this through the fall as we move forward. Additionally, the 2014 Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act Conference, the TELFRA Conference, will be held beginning September 7th. Sunday, September 7th will be kind of the registration. Myself and Joey Evans, who is the staff member, the program specialist for TELFRA, will be attending. I'll be presenting an update on board activities and the PRB and TELFRA on Monday morning on September 8th. Both Joey and I will be there Monday and Tuesday for the conference. We're looking forward to it. It's going to be in Lufkin this year. So we will keep the board apprised on anything that comes up, and obviously we'll be able to update the TELFRA plans on what transpired at the meeting and let them know about the training requirements and commentary on the study. So we will be attending that early in September, and certainly if members have any comments or questions regarding all those items, just to let me know.
Any questions? Good, thanks. The next item, item 10, is call for future PRB agenda items. So if any of the board members have something you want to put on the December agenda, please let Chris know and he can coordinate with me. So the item 11, date and location of the next PRB meeting. It's currently scheduled to be Wednesday, December 17th in Austin, hopefully here. Item 12 is finally an invitation for public comment. If anybody in the room would like to make comment, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Board. I'll try to keep it short. Just had a question reference.
Could you identify
I'm sorry.
yourself for the record?
I'm wearing 2 hats. I'm Jim Smith, and on this one, I'm representing the San Antonio Fire and Police Pension Fund. But reference to the rainy day fund, it's just a suggestion of maybe adding some suggestive language in there, because what we always have tried to do, the closer to 100% we're getting, or our funding level getting higher, we try to ratchet down our assumed rate of return to remove the risk from our fund. And I think that would kind of alleviate that separate fund. Obviously, getting rid of the risk, getting rid of that equity exposure is something we've always tried to do. And over the last year, last couple of years, we've ratcheted down our assumed rate of return about 1.5%, just as a suggestion.
Well, we appreciate the comment, especially as a practical comment like that.
Also, I did have a question, and I may have missed part of it. What was the discussion on the disclosure of the drop accounts? What was that language?
It worked, it wasn't on the individual drop accounts, it was the total drop balance as a portion of the, the aggregate. It was not in individual drop accounts at all. No, it's the portion related to the active and inactive members in the accrued liability. So it's the aggregate.
Yeah, and I guess that would be my textper's hat asking that question, because, yeah, the individual information is where there's issues.
Yeah, no, that was not part of that recommendation.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, sir.
Max Patterson, Executive Director of TechSource. Two areas I wanted to comment on. First was on the education training requirements. I just want to commend the staff and working with the staff, and Michelle in particular, that is very thorough, detailed, and I think the end product is something that we can look toward in a very positive way. It's I think the state is moving forward, that something we should have did probably a long time ago. Training is very critical. The legislature has raised that issue many times, and I'm glad to see that we have something on board to go with. And the other comment has to do with the study, financial health of the systems. I commend the staff again. The report is very thorough. I think you've touched on some sensitive areas that have been avoided in the past, and they need to be touched on. And we all in the public sector love our defined benefit plans, and we want to keep them. And the way you do that is you got to make them affordable, sustainable, and there's no reason in the world why a supporting jurisdiction should know absolutely everything that's going on with the pension plan, the funding, the status, everything that's happening with it. And the more we can push toward that end, the better. And so thank you, Chris, and the staff and the board.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate those comments, and I think the board echoes those. Any other comments or questions? Good. Thank you for the comments from the public. Otherwise, I'd have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. May, second by Mr. Raynard. All those in favor? The board stands adjourned. Thank you.
Less than 4 hours.